It's fine.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Artist's Response to a Moment. My name is Keondra Prier and I am the manager of school programs right here at the Walters Art Museum. We're hoping you're having an excellent new year, and tonight we have the most amazing pleasure of interviewing LaToya M. Hobbs, artist, educator, and mother. Good evening, LaToya, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody who's watching. Thank you for joining us.
So we're going to start looking at one of your favorite pieces from the Walters Art Collection, Hodier's African Venus. Why does this piece speak to you?
Well, I think it's just the overall sentiment of the work. I like the posture, the gesture that's implied, but I think just the total essence of her. She's beautiful, she's calm, she's poised, and it kind of reminds me of so many of the wonderful attributes that remind me of the women in my life on a day-to-day basis. And then I think it's just, well done. So it's just a beautiful piece.
It's wonderful. I hope we can talk a little bit more about the women in your life tonight. And talking about women, the Western world's relationship to Black women's bodies is conflicted, to say the least. Black women artists have played a central role in rethinking and reclaiming that relationship. Why do you center Black women in your art, and why is that so important today?
A lot of my work really just comes from my personal experiences. And so I am a Black woman, a Black identifying woman, and a lot of the important people in my life are also Black women. So I think it's just important for me to center my work around things that resonate with me, because it makes the work more authentic. And I personally like to use women that I know, that I have access to, that I have relationships with. But this work in particular, it's a self-portrait, and it's centered around the idea of motherhood. It's from a series that I've been working on called Salt of the Earth, and I'm basically personifying Black women as salt. And in terms of us being preservers of our family and culture and community. So this piece is kind of a direct result of my sort of ascent into motherhood and me thinking about the journey that I've been going on in terms of being a parent.
And it is a journey. It just doesn't happen just all of a sudden.
Right.
Yeah. So we'll move on to another work, The Everyday. And can you tell us a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, so again, this is still a part of the Salt of the Earth series. And I mentioned before, it's kind of an introspective look at my life as a mother, but I'm also kind of thinking about the broader idea of what it means to be a matriarch, and how that idea has changed over time. So I'm looking at myself, looking at my foremothers, and also looking at women around me who I feel embody the idea of what it means to be a matriarch. And that's women who have birthed children, and also women who have not birthed children, because I think the idea of what it means to mother somebody is changing. This week's work is another portrait of me, was with my two sons. So this is like special for me because it's the first work that I have used my children in. And so earlier in my career of being a mom, I kind of shied away from talking about being a mom in my subject matter, just because I felt that's something you're not supposed to do, and that you aren't necessarily taking it seriously if you talk about your life as a mom. But I got to a certain point to where I felt like this is my life. This is a part of who I am. And being a mother is a beautiful and wonderful thing. And so I just felt like, well, I can talk about whatever I want to talk about with my work. And so this piece is called The Everyday, just talking about the idea that like you never get a day off as a parent. And your children are, there with you every day. And it's talking about just kind of the everyday flow of life. And in the background there, I've kind of started this practice of featuring other Black women artists in my work. And so that painting in the background is kind of a nod to Alma Thomas's work.
How lovely. So I want to dive a little bit more into that that idea of mothering, that not birthing itself isn't what encompasses what it means to mother. And here we have the portrait of Countess Livia de Porto. There's a sense of protection part of mothering is feeling protected, and you're talking a lot about your community, and not only the community of Black women, of Black mothers, but also a community of artists that you feature in your work. Um, what else really drew you to this work of art in particular, and why is this one of the ones that you wanted to feature tonight?
Well, I think just because that happens so much throughout my day, like I could be cooking or doing something and like I just turn around and my sons are like right there or either like hugging me or on my leg or something like that. And so I think for me that that image just kind of was very familiar in terms of my day-to-day life as a mom and my interaction with my children.
And so much about your work is about that idea of everyday motherhood. And talking about motherhood, how was it to work with your mom as a model?
Well, it was kind of funny because my mother really doesn't like to take pictures. I remember like earlier when I first started in my career, or even just us being out, like she would just not want people to take a lot of pictures of her. But again, going back to this series, just thinking about the idea of the matriarch, I've really been thinking about tradition, like what traditions have been passed down to me from my grandmother and my mother, and also what am I passing down to my sons now that I'm a mom. So I think it was really important for me to include my mom as a part of this series, kind of as a cornerstone of what it means to me to be a mother. And so this piece is called Queen Anne. My mother's name is Angela, so Anne is her nickname. And so I just wanted to put that queen in front of her because we kind of use that term kind of loosely. So nowadays, but I do really hold her in high esteem. And so that kind of dominated like the color palette. Purple is one of her favorite colors. So you can see there's kind of these purple undertones throughout the work. She has these dark purple eggplant pants and there's kind of purple undertones in her shirt. And I wanted her to be kind of in an atmosphere that seemed very like lush and rich and regal. This is actually like the corner of my dining room, but I made some modifications and changes to it. And I also want to mention, I'm thinking about legacy in terms of like my family, but I'm also thinking about my legacy as an artist. And so one person that I feel is like kind of been a really, really big influence on my practice, and I call her my art mother, is Elizabeth Catlett. So if you look at the artworks on the wall back there, the one on the print on the left is a nod to Elizabeth Catlett's work. And then on the other side is a nod to Samela Lewis, who I think is also a really, really important Black woman artist who has kind of paved the way for so many other artists who are scholars and do scholarly work in terms of putting forth the stories of Black women.
And it's so beautiful because you are giving us a little bit of a history lesson in these pieces, not only with your nods to artists and the idea of this like artist community that you are being lifted up by the foundations of your art, but I can't help but notice your nod to West African print work. It looks like some wax printing in her pants and in the details in the back. It reminds me of that the work in West Africa using wax on wood to make print work. Was that intentional?
Yeah, so I use another element in my work is texture and pattern. And so I create the patterns, a lot of the patterns that you see in my work are created through the repetitive use of Adinkra symbols. And so I'll take a symbol and kind of use a stencil pattern to create like almost like a textile. And so normally when I have patterns, they're used for like the background, which can kind of allude to like wallpaper. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But also in like the clothing, and a lot of clothing you see, the textiles are created from this repetitive use of Adinkra symbols.
I moved on to the next slide so people can see that it is something that happens in multiple works, many of your works, and you're renowned as a printmaker. If people don't know that, you should really look over your over and really take in the incredible talent that and effort and planning that is required to really pull off these pieces. So could you, for our audience who have never participated in printmaking, really don't understand your artist process, could you break down how you could produce something like this?
Well, actually, this isn't a print. This is a mixed media. It's a mixed media painting. And so right now I'm kind of working in more of a mixed media style. So a lot of my current works, they are a combination of both my painting and printmaking practices together. So in undergrad, I started out as a painting major. So I, primarily worked more traditionally with oil on canvas. And then for my MFA, I studied printmaking because toward the end of my undergraduate career, I just fell in love with relief printmaking. And so in terms of my printmaking practice, that's primarily what I do. But I think this is kind of the first iteration of work where I started experimenting with combining both together. So it's kind of hard to see from the image, but on the surface, like the figure is carved in the same way that I would carve one of my wood blocks. But then I'm kind of painting on top of it and carving and painting and carving, kind of working back and forth between those two modalities. So kind of, again, taking the things that I love about my printmaking practice and taking the things that I love about my painting practice, but combining them on the same surface.
And it's incredible because it really gives you a sense of wood grain, especially within her and on her skin. And in the background, you can see the way in which you integrate the model's voice into the artwork itself by when we talked previously, you let me in on the fact that the lettering, if you look very closely, you can actually see some writing there in the background of the piece. But
yeah, so, these works come from a series called Beautiful Uprising, where I was really kind of exploring the notions of beauty, race, and identity, particular to Black women. So I was exploring, how we thought about our hair texture, our skin complexion, and our overall body image. And so part of that process, when I worked with models, I really wanted to get them to share their voice about how they saw themselves in this process. Because a lot of times you always hear the artist talking about the work, the person in the work, or you hear the viewer giving their interpretation of the person in the work, but you never really hear the model kind of sharing their opinion or their voice. And that's really important to me, thinking about this kind of history of the objectification of Black women, particularly in Western art. So I wanted to make sure that I was making their voices heard and not just kind of displaying their form. And so if you look at the title of this work, it says, "Everyone is still shocked, impressed too." So when I would work with the model, I would get them to write about, whatever they wanted to write about. So whether that was how they felt about themselves, whether they felt beautiful, what beauty meant to them, and just kind of the idea of an artist wanting to replicate their form. And so I would take those statements and put it in the background. So you mentioned you can see the text coming through. And so those are literally the model's words that I put down as the foundation of the work. And then I would take other excerpts from those statements and then use those as titles as well.
It's incredible. And something that you can't quite tell by looking at a slide, there's a lot of positive things about virtual programming and seeing these works. And I'm so glad we can be in your homes tonight. But what you're not quite getting is the scale of your pieces. So pay attention to the size, because this piece itself is, if you're standing up to it, it's 4 feet tall and 6 feet wide. So we're really seeing it's quite impressive. That's a great word. And I can't wait to be able to see your work in person. So I know I'm gabbing too much. We had a little chat before this to say, Keondra, you got to keep it brief. So we're going to zoom a little bit past because I want you all to see this, but unfortunately we have to zoom so that we have time from the audience. Here, what I found so interesting about you including this in to juxtapose between your pieces is that your nudes have a very, although they the poses point to this this idea of female nudity, and we often think of the nude being when they feature women, the gaze is averted, and this being titled After the Bath, you have a sense that you by mistake stumbled upon a woman exiting the bath, but your nudes are really different. How do you reject and reclaim this idea that women should have this averted gaze or be pious, pure, and chaste, or these ideas of womanhood in your works of art?
I think it's more, for me, it's a sense of ownership, like us, being aware of our bodies and being comfortable in our bodies. So I remember I grew up in church, and I still am active in church. But, when it dealt with women, there was always this sense that your body was never your own, that it always belonged to somebody else. Like your body belonged to God, or that you had to preserve your body for your husband. It was never like you being able to acknowledge your own body and take ownership of your own body. So I kind of wanted to bring that into question. And also, I just think our bodies are beautiful, regardless of what shape they're in. So for me, doing news was kind of a natural thing that I wanted to do, even though I kind of had some apprehension about it, kind of growing up in the Bible Belt. I'm originally from Arkansas. And so, just even when you would go to galleries, I interned at a gallery for a little bit, and you would have a nude work on the wall, and you would hear people say like unkind things, and just at the fact that there was a nude work on the wall. And I think that happens even more so when we deal with Black women's bodies, right? Because we feel like we are supposed to be presented in a certain way. And I think nudity for us is associated in a different way than it is with women from other cultures.
Absolutely. A little bit of pearl clutching used to go on, and your spirituality certainly features in your work, and can't help but segue after that to this piece entitled How Janetta Taught Us to Pray. How does faith and spirituality frame your practice and voice as an artist?
I think it moves just beyond just my practice as an artist. I think it's a part of who I am. Like I said, I grew up in church. I don't really go to a brick and mortar location right now. Well, you can't because of the pandemic. But that's kind of a core of who I am, and that's how I was brought up. And I kind of had that example from my mom and the women in my family. I can say that we are all like spiritual women and we believe in the power of prayer. And so earlier I talked about legacy and what traditions have been passed down from like generation to generation. And I think prayer is one of those things from my family, regardless of, how you choose to pray. I think prayer is important, or just this idea of looking inward and communing with God in the way that you see is right for you. But this piece is kind of a tribute to my grandmother. Her name was Janetta. And I had these memories of like when I was little and I would go spend like the summers at her house. She would wake us up super, super early, like 3:00 in the morning. We would have to like line up in the living room, me and my other cousins, and we would have to pray and we would have to read a Bible verse. And so I was telling my mom that story one day, and she was like, yeah, she made us do that too. So I was just kind of thinking about, how things get passed along. I don't wake my sons up at 3 a.m, but we do make it a point to have prayer time, before they go to bed. And so this is the kind of a tribute to her.
It's beautiful. So I was remiss in not reminding our audience that please send your questions in the chat. This is a conversation and we want you to be part of it. And so I'm going to continue on. I see a couple questions actually from our audience, so I don't want to hog the time. So I'm going to continue on with our last question, which is, well, my last question until we move on to the audience's questions. What are you doing in this time to nurture yourself as an artist with everything that's happened, even already in January of this year, but certainly since last year? How are you nurturing yourself as an artist?
Yeah, and I think just thinking about the Salt of the Earth series kind of answers that. So I talked about, what the meaning of salt of the earth and how I'm personifying women is salt, but the overall meaning of the work comes from the biblical scripture, Matthew 5:13. I think you have a slide that has that. Yeah, so it talks about you are the salt of the earth, but what if the salt has lost its taste? But the thing that I'm also thinking about is the second part where it says it is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. And so when I think about that, I also think about Black women's labor and the fact that sometimes we are so busy being everything for everybody else that we forget to pour into ourselves. So for me, that kind of asks the questions like, what happens when we don't pour into ourselves? What happens when the salt is cast out, right? And so I've been really making it a point to get back to things that I personally enjoy, to nurture myself. And that, we kind of hear this, term self-care kind of, I want to say it's thrown around, but it's become a lot more popular to use that term. But I don't think we should ever let it become kind of cliche, but I think it is important, like self-care. I forget the quote, but the sentiment of the quote is that self-care is like a revolutionary act. especially with, a lot of the things that have been happening and violence toward Black people. We have to make sure that we're taking time to take care of ourselves and restoring ourselves as we continue to go out and to do the work to build our community. And so some things for me is just as simple as like having scented candles around. I'm really responsive to smells. I like to have, nice fragrances around. So in the morning, I'll just wake up and light a candle just to make sure that I have that small pleasantry to go throughout my day. I love fresh flowers. So sometimes small things like that can add up, to important ways to maintain a sense of self-care. And also now I've just been learning the power of saying no. I have,
boundaries.
Setting boundaries and giving myself rest, giving myself grace, and just being okay with not doing everything that comes across my email. Like you don't have to say no to, you don't have to say yes to every show. You don't have to, say yes, even if it's maybe a good thing. But if you need to rest, then it's okay to rest. And even now with my studio practice, I'm on sabbatical this semester from teaching, but I'm working on a really, really big project. But I'm just allowing myself to pace myself just to make sure that I'm able to have longevity, in the process.
Thank you. So much wisdom being passed on tonight. Thank you for that. Remember to replenish yourself, people. You cannot create without nurturing yourself. Like the earth needs to be watered, so do you. We have a few questions from the audience that I want to jump into, if that's okay, LaToya.
Yeah, sure.
So from Lauren Davidson, we have a question. Hi, LaToya. Can you speak a bit about your choice of patterns and some of your backgrounds in clothing? I have noticed Adinkra symbols and perhaps Spanish patterns. So we talked a little bit about the Adinkra, but didn't talk about Spanish patterns.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that there's Spanish per se. So one thing that I like to do is I like to cultivate my own patterns and paper. So maybe if you could go back to the screen of how Janetta taught us to pray, I think that could be a good example. And so there's two symbols used in this one. The one that is on the clothing is called an Adinkrahini. And that basically, means like leadership or, the core of the symbol means leadership. And so I knew I wanted to have that symbol to be on my mother's clothing. So the piece is kind of like a diptych. So there's the other one is a portrait of myself, and we're adorned in the same pattern. So sometimes I associate patterns with specific people if it reminds me of the person, and sometimes it's just purely like aesthetic. For the aesthetic reasons that I want to use a particular symbol. So it kind of varies here and there. So more specifically, I've been using Adinkra symbols, but sometimes if I'm like at an art store and I see some type of stencil that just looks really cool and I haven't seen another artist use it before, then I'll kind of adapt that into the work sometimes.
Wonderful. You got a lot of shout outs saying you're the best. So
thank you.
Shout out to Imani Hayes, who used to be at the Walters.
Hey.
Absolutely the best. And we're going to move on to our second question from Schroeder Cherry. And he is saying, how has your trip to Morocco impacted your work?
I haven't actually been able to unpack Morocco. We went so I won a travel grant through the Municipal Art Society of Baltimore, and I decided to go to Morocco just because, they're known for having really, really beautiful patterns. And I wanted to see, how they were displayed in that particular culture. And so like 2 days after we got there, we basically were stranded. the airspace shut down. People was like totally shutting everything down. And so we had to end our trip early. So I really didn't even, we went to maybe like 2 or 3 palaces and got some good photos. And then after that, it was like, how do we get back home? Because they, we flew through Royal Air Morocco and they closed their airspace and we couldn't contact anybody. So after that, it was just like, let's focus on getting back home to our boys and being safe. And so I really haven't had chance to really process those things. Because right after I got back, then I had to get ready for the Sondheim. And then after the Sondheim, I had to get ready for the semester. And then so Now,
whirlwind
for just shows. So hopefully this summer I'll be able to like really sit down and go back and look at the images. And I already have ideas for kind of some being inspired by the colors there. So most of my recent work has been kind of monochromatic and using golds and metallics, but hopefully this summer I want to bring back more colors. And so I'm really thinking about color palettes that are inspired by a lot of the things I saw in Morocco.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to be seeing some new work from there, from your trip. So I'm really looking forward to that. The third question is from I Love, and her question, their question is, what other pieces of art do you like?
In terms of like my own art or like other artists?
I say you interpret it as you will. I think.
Okay, well,
whatever kind of art inspires you, maybe.
Yeah, so I can talk about other artists who I enjoy, just any of their work. So first, Elizabeth Catlett, hands down, one of my favorite artists. Like I mentioned earlier, she's my art mom. Really inspired my practice as a printmaker. Kerry James Marshall, I saw his exhibit Mastery when it was at the Met Brewer, so like 2 years ago, just completely blown away. And he's kind of inspired the current project that I'm working on. Who else? Anjideka Crosby. She's a Nigerian-born artist. I think she maybe lives in LA now. But I really love her process. Just kind of the idea of how she takes all these different medias and techniques and brings them together really seamlessly on the same surface. So I really enjoy her work, and also how she uses interior space to give context to the people that she's featuring in the work. So I really enjoy her work. Another one of my early influences was Micheline Thomas. I pretty much love anything. Anything by her. And then there's just a lot of people doing really great work now, but I think those are some of the core people who have influenced my practice. Other Black female printmakers, obviously, Valerie Maynard, who is here in Baltimore, Margaret Burroughs. So, yeah.
So we have our homework cut out. If you don't know those names, okay, now it's additional knowledge. You can go out and make sure that you're familiar with the work that inspires such a great artist. We also have a question from Liz Miller, who was a former Walters Artist Talk guest. So welcome back, Liz. And her question is, I think I lost it actually oh, here we go. What is your next big undertaking?
Yeah, so currently I'm working on producing works for an exhibit that will be at the Baltimore Museum of Art, in an exhibit called All Due Respect. I'll be exhibiting with 3 other local artists. It's myself, Makita Ahuja, Cindy Chang, and Lauren Adams, but we'll each have kind of our own separate gallery spaces on the 3rd floor of the museum. So I'm working on one like big monumental work, so like the biggest thing I've done of my career. It's a piece called Carving Out Time. And it basically takes you through a day in my life as a mother from start to finish. So from the morning, like all the way to the evening. So I'm kind of in the midway point of that piece now. So it's a wood carving. And I'm really excited to continue to share. I think I kind of showed the first, like a little video of like the first portion of it, just to kind of let people know what I've been working on and what they can kind of continue to expect. So I think each month I'll kind of share a new section of that project.
And where can we see that?
It's going to be at the BMA.
The clips that you're sharing, are they?
Oh, it's on IG. So if you go to my IG, it's just LaToya Hobbs, or also on Facebook, also LaToya Hobbs. You can see the clip that I showed. I think I posted it last week.
So I haven't seen it, so I'm going to check it out right after this. So we are at overtime, really, because we were supposed to only talk for 30 minutes. We are hitting 30 minutes, actually. If anyone has any more questions, please reach out. This is your last call for questions with the amazing LaToya M. Hobbs. I don't see any additional questions. And my final question was, of course, to see where else we could see your work, and you've just answered that. So that's it for tonight. Please discover more upcoming artist talks, performances, curatorial lectures, and more. just go to our website at thewalters.org/events. And we'll be doing this again. LaToya, I'm so glad we got to do this. I was so sad when in the last time when we had technical difficulties, but everything happens for a reason, and I'm so glad that you were able to make it tonight. And I hope everyone can go out and see your exhibition at the BMA when it comes out. And until then, certainly keep abreast as to what you're doing by checking out your website, going to your Instagram account. That's all for tonight. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody.